Let me now share with you what I discovered would walk me in the direction of peace and joy and happiness, because to me that's really what this is all about. And this is where I struggled. What I noticed was it was much easier to figure out how I got to anger and sadness and despair and fear. But I struggled to find peace and joy and happiness. I recognized there weren't that many good role models for that. Mickey and Jay from Seattle were saying that it's almost dangerous to walk around with a smile on your face. People think you're a little crazy. What I began to recognize is that the imagination is incredibly powerful. And I can use it to imagine all the worst possible outcomes, or I can use it to imagine the kind of life I want to create. That life really is an act of creation. And the first step of creation is to see in your mind's eye what you want to create. And this is no big secret like they've tried to tell you it is. The fact is, we're using that strategy in different sectors of our society already. Olympic class athletes, most all have a psychologist who teaches the athlete to see in their mind's eye their dive, their run, their performance, their routine, over and over again in perfection. Why? Because we've discovered that when the athlete does that, it increases their performance. That by imagining the performance, you trigger the body for success. Artists, sculptors, painters will talk about seeing the finished painting on the blank piece of canvas before they take the first stroke. I've got a friend of mine who's a sculptor. He'll pick up a piece of wood or granite and he can see the finished carving in that block of wood before he even takes the first cut. And so seeing in one's mind's eye is a very practical strategy. Businesses do this too. Successful businesses declare what their financial picture will be in 12 months. They call it a budget or a financial plan. Because what they've discovered is that when they declare it, it increases the likelihood of getting there. No successful business says, well, let's wait and see what shows up at the end of the fiscal year. So I've discovered that using my imagination is absolutely critical. And I've come to recognize that there are two tools of the imagination that are important. One is what I call intention. And what that's about is, what do I intend? What does success look like? What outcome do I want to have happen? Let me give you an example how I use that in my counseling practice now. I do a lot of work with couples that are struggling in their relationship. And usually what happens is they come into my office, they sit down and they begin to tell me how awful their husband is or how awful their wife is. And I used to be trained in a client-centered model which would allow the client to set the tone or the direction for the therapy. And so in the beginning of my work, I used to listen to people for hours tell me how awful things are. And what do you think happens when you allow that to happen? Do you think they go home and make love after the session? And when I began to understand the importance of imagination, understand the importance of intention, I would change the way I worked. And so when they would start to tell me these awful stories, I would say, you know what, I'm not really interested in that. And they would look at me like I'm a little strange, and they'd say, well, isn't that why we're here? And I would say, well, that's not how I work. So they would say, well, how do you work? I say, well, the conversation I would really like to have with you is, I'd like each of you to declare out loud what a successful relationship looks like from your perspective. And what do you think happens when I ask that question? Silence. And then almost every time one turns to the other and says, you go first. And it's so common now, I just wait, and then that comes. And what I've noticed is that if I say, tell me what's wrong, they can talk until they're exhausted, until they run out of money. If I say, tell me what success looks like, they struggle. And I've discovered until they can describe it, until they can articulate it, until they can make it so clear that all of us in the room know exactly what we're talking about, they can't get there. Sometimes when I do this as a workshop and I've got more time to play, I bring my tennis balls with me. And I look for a volunteer and I give them the tennis balls and I say, put a garbage can a few feet away, and I say, see if you can get the balls in the garbage can. And so they throw them into the garbage can, and they're usually pretty successful with it. It's not a big challenge. I asked if they want to do it again, and they usually say, okay, so I give them the balls back again. But this time I put a blindfold on them. And then while they're blindfolded, I move the garbage can. And of course, they don't know the garbage can's been moved, so they throw the balls where they thought it was. They take off the blindfold, they look, and they're not too happy with me. And so I say, so what do you think is the moral of the story here? What's the purpose of this little exercise? And they usually say something like, well, you can't trust anybody. And I say, no, that's not the point. The point is you can't hit a target you can't see. And so it's important for us to declare our intention. What does success look like? When I wake up in the morning, there's a pause before I jump out of bed, and what's my intention for this day? What does success look like? Before a phone call, before an email, before a meeting, I stop and pause. What is success? Where am I moving towards? And what I've discovered is that when I declare my intention, I'm more successful in getting the outcome. Let me give you a little example of playing with intention. A number of years ago, my car broke down on a Friday and it wasn't worth repairing. But I needed a vehicle by Monday morning to go to work. So Friday night I said, okay, so what do I want? What's my intention? I decided that I didn't want to take out a loan. I looked at my bank account. I had $1,000 of money that I was willing to spend. I decided I wanted a 4-door vehicle because I had 2 small children. I decided I wanted something reliable, so it should probably be a foreign import. Saturday morning I woke up. I put Josh in his wheelchair. We were walking in the lane behind our home. I'm outside maybe 10 minutes. A neighbor notices us in the lane, and he opens up his back door and he yells. And he says, Ted, do you know anybody who wants to buy a car? And I said, well, yes, I do. What have you got? And he said, well, last night was my parents' 25th wedding anniversary, and so my brothers and sisters and I bought them a new car. And so I'm selling their old car. I said, well, what is it? He said, well, it's old. You know, he says it's 18 years old. But he said they bought it new, and they have babied this thing, so it's really in mint condition. I said, what is it? It's a Toyota Corolla. I said, how many doors is it? He says, it's 4. I said, how much do you want for it? And he said, well, I put an ad on the paper that's going to run tonight to say $1,200, but I'll take $1,000 cash. Now, sometimes when people hear me tell that story, they say, Ted, that's a nice story, but that's not the way the world works. My question is, what if it is? What if it is the way the world works, that our intention is very powerful? Einstein actually said that imagination is more important than knowledge. And so if that's how the world works, most of us are in trouble, because most of us are thinking 9 times as many negative thoughts as positive thoughts. Sometimes people will say to me, Ted, that's just that new age stuff. Well, the interesting fact is that that's not a new idea. It's actually an old idea. And the reason I tell you this is because what I've learned is that in the 1950s, they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm sure most of you are aware of that. And they deciphered those scrolls. And I'm told that in one of the scrolls it asked the question, how do miracles happen? And the answer that's given in the scroll that's more than 2,000 years old says, if you want to create a miracle, 2 actions are necessary. The first one is to see in your mind's eye what you want to have happen. The second one is to feel what it would feel like to have that show up in your life. You put the seeing and the feeling together, and miracles happen. So this is not a new age idea. It's an ancient idea that we have lost track of. Science has demonstrated the power of the imagination. They did a piece of research with basketball players where they had a group of them shoot baskets to determine how successful they were, what percentage of sinking the basket. And then they divided their group into 3. And with one group they said, for the next month we want you to practice shooting baskets for an hour a day. The second group, they said to them, we don't want you to do anything, don't even pick up a basketball. And the third group, they said to them, we want you to imagine shooting baskets for an hour a day. Imagine in your mind. A month later, they retested them, and this is what happened. The first group that practiced for an hour a day improved between 12 and 15%. The second group that didn't do anything shot exactly the same percentage they had before. The third group that imagined shooting baskets for an hour a day improved between 12 and 15%. Harvard Business School, not exactly known for New Age thinking, did a piece of research back in the 1950s where they asked their graduating class out of their business school, how many of you have got a life plan for yourself? 3% of the students of that graduating year had written out a life plan. 30 years later, they recontacted that graduating class and they evaluated the level of success of those students. And the 3% that had written out a life plan were by far the most successful of the group. Now Harvard Business School has all of their graduates write out life plans, declare their intention. Not New Age thinking.